What if I told you that the Panama Canal, one of the most vital arteries for global trade, is becoming a political pawn between the United States and China? Controlled by the United States between 1904 to 1999, the canal now has Chinese companies operating critical ports at both ends. Could this iconic waterway spark the next big conflicts in U.S. China relations? Doug, let's dive into the history first. How and why did U.S. relinquish control of the Panama Canal? And what was the history that's still shaping today's headline?
Well, I mean, this is part of, the continuing evolution of a integrated global political economy in which, post World War II era, there were still a number of areas that places like the United States and a number of European nations sort of had strong control. I mean, we don't call it colonization um, any longer, but there was strong presence and strong control. And at some point, it just became clear that Panama deserved the right to just control their own land, and so the United States transferred the land back to Panama. I mean, this is or just relinquished its presence and control in Panama. I mean, it was Panamanian land, but it was just the U.S. was playing a very, very significant role there. So, when President Trump says things like, we gave the land to Panama, not to China, and now we're taking it back. It's a little bit disingenuous to talk about it that way because, this is just part of a global political economy in which Panama deserved the right to control its own land. And it happens to have this very valuable asset, which is this waterway, this canal between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so, if you don't want to go through the Panama Canal, you need to sail down the east coast of South America and around the tip of South America to get to the Pacific. And so this is a very, very valuable asset. And so the Panama Canal becomes a very important link in global trade. But it's Panama's. And so, yeah,
That makes sense.
yeah.
Panama has gone through several expansions over the years. Could you explain some of the key milestones in these projects and how they influence its global importance?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, there is the relinquishing of the land to Panama and like really just allowing Panama to continue to develop its own positioning. But then the canal has been refined and built into a really powerful waterway. And um, the Panama has also attracted investment so there are 5 ports that are a part of the canal. And these are 5 ports divided by the two ends of it. And Panama has continued to develop its position as a key player in the global trade that passes between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so key trade from the Western Hemisphere to Asia. And so, part of that development has been attracting investment and working with different companies. One of the companies that is one of the most efficient port management companies in the world is the Hong Kong-based CK Hutchinson Holdings, which is a publicly traded company. It's not a Chinese company per se. It's a Hong Kong-based company, and it came out of that. It grew up in that area, but it's a publicly traded company that's based in Hong Kong. And so, that CK Hutchinson Holdings, is very good at what they do, and Panama has worked with different companies around the world to run their ports efficiently, and so CK Hutchinson Holdings is a player in managing 2 of the ports, but that's just 2 out of the 5, and Panama has been very um, aggressive about reaching out to different countries around the world to continue to develop as an economy and to develop the ports as a really efficient global trading system. And so it's been a very interesting thing to observe over the course of the last 40 years.
Well, like you mentioned, the current administration is calling to reclaim Panama Canal for the United States. What triggered this desire? And do you know how it's being received in Canada? What implication might this have for U.S. Panama relationship?
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, you mentioned Canada, and this is just, to me, there's a lot of, ridiculous flapping going around here. But like, so as soon as President Trump took office, first we hear about Greenland and the idea that the United States should control Greenland. And then we hear that, President Trump is suggesting that Canada should become the 51st United State. And then we hear about Panama and the desire to reclaim control of Panama. And then we hear about, the Gaza Strip and Palestine. And, this is a very, very bizarre time for the U.S. political economy. And, you know, I have to assume that this bluster is going to die down a little bit, because this is just going to alienate a lot of the world from the United States. I mean, I've heard just in the last couple of days that now Canada is talking about joining the EU, or opening talks to really kind of be more deeply embedded with the EU, because they're so offended by this idea that Canada should just be taken over by the United States and become the 51st state. And so Panama is obviously much smaller, and it's a much smaller trading hub than a place like Canada, but it does, again, play a critical role in the global trading system because of the canal. And so I think what we're seeing, Christine, is just, a lot of blustery rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration around not just Panama, but a number of different places. And I think it's A, disingenuous, and B, foolhardy, and C, maybe even dangerous. So, yeah.
Well, my understanding is that Panama had longstanding ties with Taiwan, but formally established ties with China in 2017. And so, wondering how this is affecting kind of the U.S. Panama relationship.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it is an interesting journey to be thinking about this. And, as you and I have discussed in the past, I mean, the tensions over Taiwan's role in the global political economy, and Taiwan's, being a part of China. So if we go back to 1979, when Deng Xiaoping signed the normalization agreement with Jimmy Carter, part of the normalization agreement was that Taiwan is a part of China, and one country, two systems. And, China would respect the idea of one country, two systems, but Taiwan was and will always be a part of China. And that's kind of a core aspect of this. Now, that has been confused by a lot of nations, because, some nations have continued to have different types of relationships with Taiwan. And, the Chinese government, particularly under Xi Jinping, wants everybody to affirm that, Taiwan is a part of China, and it's fundamentally built into that geographic system, but also political system. And so when Panama had a separate relationship with Taiwan, this limited the ability that companies under the influence of the Chinese central government could actually kind of invest in Panama and build things like efficient ports and such. And so, again, I don't want to sound like I'm contradicting myself, because I just made the point that CK Hutchison Holdings is a publicly traded company. It's not a Chinese state-owned company, but all companies that operate in China are under the influence of the Chinese central government. And especially in the last 10 years of the Xi Jinping administration, that issue has been heightened. And so I think the message was subtly, and perhaps not so subtly, given to Panama, that if you really want Chinese investment in building efficient ports and continuing to develop the land, then you need to focus on your relationship with China. And that happened, as you mentioned, in 2017.
Well, one of the major concerns that China is asserting more influence over the canal is that Huawei has a contract with Panama to supply surveillance cameras. Well, the U.S. government is fearing that this could be used to gather intelligence. Comments?
Yeah, Huawei is an interesting player in all of this. I mean, Huawei has had a long, troubled history with the United States. I mean, as you know, I used to advise the Huawei leadership when they were struggling over potential ban from the United States, and eventually they were kicked out of the United States. And then we've gone more aggressively in trying to control what access to microchips Huawei could get access to. And, the CHIPS Act really pushes this forward. And so Huawei is definitely a centerpiece, because It's always been suspected in the United States government that Huawei was a part of the technology or was core to the technology that was giving China access to the surveillance and through switching systems around the world. And so yeah, and so the fact that China can have companies like CK Hutchison Holdings, but also Huawei involved in the development of places of the Panama Canal, this makes people in the United States uneasy. Now, here again, I would note that just like with CK Hutchison Holdings, Huawei is not a Chinese state-owned company. It is a private company, and we don't have strong evidence that this is exactly what's happening, but as you and I have discussed in different areas, we make a lot of assumptions about this, not just with Huawei, but with companies like TikTok. And so there are a lot of concerns over how much data China is able to gather outside of China, and whether or not some of that data gathering is happening with shipping that includes organizations that are shipping through the Panama Canal from the United States. And so it's a very interesting dynamic.
Well, getting back to the Chinese, well, the company CK Hutchinson and Landbridge Group, they operate key ports at both ends of Panama Canal. There are actually two uses. They're both used for commercial and military purposes. So, in that case, how should we assess China's expanding presence in that region? And how do we think about U.S. China relations in terms of security and global influence?
Well, I mean, you raise a really, really important and sensitive point. As you know, I'm a big believer in the idea that economic integration is better than, an economic Cold War or a full-fledged military Cold War. We lived for many years with that kind of dynamic with the Soviet Union, and I don't think it's healthy. I think we do much better if we continue to have integrated economic systems, and we have our companies like Apple and Tesla operating in China, and we have Chinese companies operating in the United States, and we're all sort of together in the system of we're all making money in capitalism together. That being said, the United States has the largest and most powerful military in the world, but China has a very large and powerful military too. And the more tense things get, the more we're going to see the spread of presences, including military presences around the world. And so, the Panama Canal being very close to the United States, but being such a key waterway for the flow of trading goods, but also the flow of military vessels and military goods across the world. Um, it's an issue. And so here again, I would just go back to the idea that we do much better off having careful, respectful, diplomatic integration and economic integration, and just continuing to work together to have a safe, peaceful world. But we're headed in a bad direction with respect to that, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently visited Latin America as a way to frame the America First policy to try to curb China's influence and deepen regional cooperation. So, in your opinion, do you think the trip was effective in countering China's growing tie in Latin America, particularly in Panama?
I mean, here again, I get very nervous when people like President Trump say, we didn't give it to China and we're taking it back, or people like Marco Rubio say, it's unacceptable that China has control of the entry and exit ports. And as you and I just discussed, Chinese companies, one Chinese company or two Chinese companies have significant influence over the economic monitoring and efficient running of two of the five ports. But that's okay. Like, this is capitalism, so we can't tell Panama what to do, and we shouldn't be able to, because Panama is an independent country, and they're not doing anything that is internationally illegal. This is global capitalism. And so, for me, the Rubio trip just looked like a lot of muscle flexing and, showing that we have a presence here. And, he's down there looking over the canal and, talking about how horrible it is that China's there. And, so here again, like, Panama's a very small country, and it's sort of sitting in the middle on this particular issue between the two largest economies in the world and two very large militaries. Um, and so, it definitely is a muscle flexing moment that Rubio showed up there, but I don't know if it helps anybody in terms of diplomacy. It didn't feel like a very careful diplomatic visit to me. It just looked like, showing up and saying some sharp things. And so to me, it just puts Panama in the middle, and it further uh, hurts our relationship with China.
Doug, stepping back to look at the big picture, how does Panama Canal fit in the broader narrative of U.S. China competition in Latin America?
Well, that's a really interesting question because, you know, U.S. China competition in Latin America, again, we sort of think of often when I talk about the building out of the BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative, it feels like China is really pivoting away from um, from deep ties with the Western world, with the United States and with Europe. Um, and interestingly, I had a conversation with several European journalists yesterday, and they're really, really just down on how poor the relationship with the United States is right now. And so it was very interesting to just hear their own personal views of like, this narrative of you have the Western world and you have the G7 and then you have China pivoting away. And, I've been a part of that narrative because I've always said Belt and Road Initiative is really kind of a way of China pivoting towards Africa and Central Asia. But remember that BRICS, I mean, the B in BRICS is Brazil. And so there's significant relationship. If China is really building out this counterbalance to the G7 and its BRICS, Brazil is a key part of it. And China's investment and development with trade relations with Brazil, and even some nations that are not officially a part of BRICS, like Argentina, these are really important moves for China. And, I think, again, if we're not careful, if we continue to alienate China, you and I have discussed that China holds a lot of the cards here because China is in a very powerful position, not just as the second largest economy in the world, but because companies like Apple and Tesla are so deeply dependent on China. But, China is going to continue to spread its wings as the U.S. kind of pulls back by canceling USAID and, kind of pulling out of giving aid to places like sub-Saharan Africa. China is going to continue to have its presence felt and grow. But Latin America is not excluded from that. And so BRICS is a part of that, but just general investment in trade relations with Latin American countries I think it's a big deal. It's really important.
Thank you, Doug. Panama Canal remains not just a gateway for global trade, but a flashpoint for geopolitical tensions. Thank you for joining us today on China in the News, Conversation with Professor Guthrie. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more discussions on stories shaping U.S. China relations. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Christine.
Bye bye.